Rob Brown here with a Talent in Accounting special here on the Accounting Influencers Podcast Network. Thrilled to have with me today a recruitment specialist from Wade Macdonald. We're going to hear all about Chris Goulding. But Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Chris, you specialize in the accounting and finance sector. Give us a little bit about your background.
So I joined a major recruiter in the UK when I was just 21 years of age. So I've now spent, sadly, over half my life in this profession.
It's quite rare people stay in it for that long. It's a brutal profession, isn't it?
I think it's one that once you're stuck in, Rob. But yeah, no,
Right.
This is because we love it so much. But I spent 19 years in my first company, moved through lots of different director roles. And then about 6 years ago, I moved to more of an SME in Wade Macdonald, who gave me the opportunity to become managing director. So we've been around about 32, 33 years now, 20 or so recruiters, and the majority of us are working within that accountancy and finance sector, which is where I've spent all my career.
You've done some interesting research into the finance function. If we drew a Venn diagram, and I'm a former high school maths teacher, so a lot of our listeners, watchers will relate to that. There is obviously a big overlap with the accounting and finance worlds. And tell us a little bit about this piece of research that you've done, Chris, and what brought it about.
Yeah, no, the first thing is when we're talking about accountancy and finance, I think it's one pool. So it's not financial services, it's all accountancy, basically. So the reason we put the research together is that, you know, it's pretty obvious during the last few years, and perhaps sped up a bit by the pandemic, that the skill sets required to reach the top, or while you're in that top role, have changed. So we wanted to put a bit of research together, speaking to current leaders about what their journey was, but also asking them how they think that will be different for the next generation, to try and help those people that are working their way through the ranks within accountancy and finance with the ambition to get to that finance director or CFO type role.
And are we talking predominantly about accountants in industry and commerce, or accountants in private practice, or a little bit of both, Chris?
Yeah, so a lot of the people that took part, which I'm sure will be covered off, started their careers within practice.
Yeah.
But this is very much focused at those that are within either the commercial world or within non-for-profit. So outside of practice, it's not looking at your partners within practice or any of those. It is very much outside of that.
You pick up on an interesting trend, though. We have heard anecdotally that accountants are leaving private practice and increasingly going into tech, going into commerce, going into industry. I don't know why that would be, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, that's something I know when we discussed a few weeks ago, I'd say has probably been the case throughout time.
Right.
So I think that practices would say, and where I used to work, we have practice specialists, would say that the hardest thing for them is probably keeping people once they get to qualification stage or a couple of years post-qualified, whether it's because a lot of the career route would still be audit, and obviously that can be quite draining, long hours, time away from home, or it's just to try and influence more of a commercial business on the growth path. You know, you could argue it either way, but I think it's a very good technical grounding for people, but quite often it's got a lifespan, and it's probably a bit like you just said with recruiters. An awful lot of people do it for a few years and then try and take that skill set and use it somewhere else.
Do we see people going the other way, Chris, real quick? They're coming out of industry and commerce roles into private practice?
Most private practices don't want people that have been trained within commerce.
Is that right? Why is that?
Because they're not auditors. So that the time you will see it, and it does happen, is if the role is doing other companies' accounts while they're working for the practice, or maybe some internal roles within the practice. But generally speaking, they don't. What we did see a trend of is the practice sector has found it harder to retain talent or recruit new talent, is they would take people perhaps who'd started in practice, gone into commerce, and were willing to take the route back into it. But it's probably quite a rare thing for that to happen.
Yeah. Well, it's applaudable that you have not just stuck a finger in the air and say which way the wind is blowing in accounting and finance, but you've undergone some rigorous research here, and we'll put a link to your survey into our show notes. Is there anything that surprised you when you conducted this, or was it pretty much as you expected?
I don't know if surprise is the right word, but it's definitely different from when I've done the research in the past.
Okay.
So I was involved in some probably 10 or 15 years ago. And I guess if we take a very boring stat to start off with, when I did it all those years ago, you probably had 40% of FDs and CFOs that had been trained in ACA.
Right.
And started within practice, obviously doing that qualification. And then there would have been a pretty even breakdown outside of that between CIMA and ACCA. When we've done it this time, we found that the same percentage of people with ACA, so it's still around about, I think it's 39%, so the same number really. But there were also 39% of people in that role that were CIMA qualified, which would suggest that over the last 10, 15 years since I first looked at this, the role of an FD and CFO has definitely become more strategic, more business partnering, and the technical skills maybe aren't as important as they were when we looked at it a few years ago. And I think that, again, I know you'll ask me a bit more later, and I don't want to spoil the surprise for everyone who's listening, but that role is becoming more and more strategic. And more commercial, more and more analytical, and it's expected to continue that way and rapidly.
Now, you've thrown a few abbreviations in there. We do have an international audience. CFO, obviously, Chief Financial Officer. FD is used a lot in the UK, Finance Director. You said some of the professional associations, Chris, just for our international audience, just define those for us a little bit.
Yeah, okay, so your ACA is your equivalent of what CPA, CA, depending on where people are. So you're going to get that qualification from working within an accountancy practice.
Yeah, chartered accountant type of role.
Yeah, so there's only a few commercial organisations that could even sign off that qualification. CIMA is the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. So traditionally, you would think that people who were doing that role were going to be management accountants and more commercial. And ACCA was more for your technical. You might still do it in practice, but you could do it in commerce as well. There's definitely been more overlap over the years with CIMA and ACCA. So I wouldn't say that one is purely commercial and one is more technical now. But definitely with your ACA, then your chartered accountants are. So.
Got it. You brought up an interesting stat with your demographics on the amount of women versus men in the profession. We know that 53% of accountants worldwide are female, 47% are men. That's taken an accounting degree, if you like, or some kind of qualification. But certainly in the accounting and finance cohort you looked at, 70-30, Chris, wasn't it?
Yep. Yeah. So there's an awful lot more men in leadership roles than there are women. Interestingly, we also did a piece on how to reach the top in human resources, which are rather specialism here, and that was the complete opposite when we did it. So the leadership roles in HR were more dominated by females, but no, in accountancy it hasn't evened itself out still as the years have moved on. There were a number of reasons that were pointed out because we did try and dig a bit deeper into that, but the major appears to have been around career breaks for maternity and then not being able to or not being given the opportunity to continue the career after having the break as rapidly as males, and also I think it was the lack of flexibility within the roles over the before the pandemic. Certainly hybrid working wasn't that common in the UK, and part-time leaders, probably there were less of them. So we're hoping as we go forward that the change in working practices in the UK with more flexibility around start finish times and also where you work might give more opportunity to even that stat out as we move forwards.
Yeah. And no surprise, as you hinted earlier, that the CFOs and financial directors out there, a lot of them, 53% you say, have worked in an accounting practice. It shows that's a really good environment to breed these top financial leaders.
Yeah, as I said before, I think that would have been a higher stat 10, 15 years ago, but the technical training that's given is still very, very valuable as you move forwards. The majority of those as well will have worked within a Big Four practice.
Yeah.
So that's been a sought after skill set for many years. As I say, it's probably not going to be such a prerequisite going forward, I don't think, and that stat is dropping. But it's still a very valuable place to start, giving you a really good grounding and some great training.
There's a lot of big money in the Big Four firms. Obviously, industry is competing salary-wise to get some of those people and lure them out. But why do you feel the dependence on the Big Four firms might drop, Chris?
Moving forwards to get to leadership roles.
Yeah.
I just think it's the key skills that were being pulled out by the current leaders that future leaders will have were far less around technical accounting, less around audit, less around tax, less around the financial accounting piece, and far more around FP&A, so your financial planning and analysis, far more around data analysis, being able to take big data sets and actually interpret them, far more around storytelling of what data is saying and explaining that to business. So it's just this whole business partnering was a much larger skill set that is being pulled out by leaders, saying that's where people will come from.
Yeah.
And potentially when you're doing audit, although you may well be having some commercial involvement with an organization, you may not be getting as much of that as you could be if you were working in commerce from the beginning.
Yeah. Given your report is called Route to the Top of Finance, you put an interesting quote in there that says, as long as you don't get yourself pigeonholed in a transactional role and preferably study towards a professional qualification, the starting point for a career in finance doesn't really matter in the long term. Just unpack that a little bit for us, Chris.
And I guess that's why I'm saying the reliance on the practice background may not be as high. Because when you're really breaking it down and seeing where people are coming from, as long as they're getting eventually into this commercial piece and your FP&A, it doesn't necessarily make a huge difference where they've started. So the qualification is absolutely key, at least getting one. So only 3% of leaders didn't have a recognised accountancy qualification. And by that, I mean either a UK or one from abroad, because some of the people did have. But some people will have started even doing purchase ledger or accounts payable. Some people will have started in an all-round transactional role, so getting involved with that, credit, bank recs, whatever it might be. But as long as they were using that as a grounding and then getting out relatively quickly in line with their studies, it doesn't seem to have held people back. And it's not thought that it will hold people back going forwards.
We hear a lot about a well-rounded professional these days and need to have skills across a wider section of the business. We'll go on to that strategic insight in a while rather than just being transactional. But you have pointed out in your report that the globalization, people are coming from different backgrounds, different countries, people are coming from outside finance into the finance function. So hopefully these leadership roles are embracing a whole range of backgrounds.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when I looked into the data more, although a percentage of those people will have worked outside of finance or outside of accountancy at some point during their career, they either started and did a short period and then moved into accountancy and still probably started nearer the bottom, or they got through part qualified, and then experienced other departments and moved back in. So it's not as easy as saying go off and study in HR, do that for 20 years and you can still end up a finance director, because I think that's probably going to be quite difficult, because you're still going to have to start at the bottom of accountancy if you do that. Sure.
And even along the road, it can be a little bit rocky. You point out some factors that slow progression, those bumps in the road. And you said that nearly 2/3 of people you surveyed felt that during the career, there'd been occasions when their progress had been slowed. Talk to us about some of those factors slowing progression, Chris.
Yeah, sure. So I think, we've already highlighted one of them, which is career breaks or having children.
Yeah.
So that was quite a big one. Other than that, there's some people who bosses maybe didn't progress as quickly as they would like, so they felt they were held back beneath their boss. You've got some people who would say that their face didn't fit, or they didn't get on with their boss. So the normal human things, unfortunately, which,
Yes.
and again, without digging deeper into that, that's very much the person's opinion who hasn't progressed as quickly as they wanted to, whether it be perception or reality, but there was some of that within there as well. So most of it is normal stuff. I think not getting the qualification quickly enough held some people back, or as quickly as they would have hoped. So if they're failing exams along the way, they might have felt that held up some of their progression. And some people found it difficult to put in the hours to progress at the same time as studying, which again is a common thing we hear of.
Yeah.
Especially if you're trying to do that study at the same time as other external factors, maybe having a family, which can be particularly difficult.
A feature of finance and accounting qualifications traditionally has been the technical side. You've got to know tax, you've got to know your way around a finance document, but increasingly the soft skills are becoming important in leadership roles, aren't they? Talk to us about what you found for what's needed in the future for leaders to progress in accounting and finance, Chris.
Yeah, sure. So I guess there's a couple of bits you could focus in on. So firstly, I think from a day-to-day doing your own job while you're progressing, is that business partnering piece. It is being able to talk to people at all different levels, analyze that data, and then, as we said, storytell or put it into a way that people who don't work within finance can understand it, and add value commercially, whether that's cost savings, whether it's where to spend the money in order to get more back on your ROI. The other piece is your softer man management skills. And
the dreaded soft skills, huh?
Yeah, and that's definitely again a moving piece, because traditionally you'd be sat with your team virtually every day, unless you're managing global teams that are elsewhere in the world. But most people will have had experience of sitting with their teams nearly every day, maybe doing the job with them, maybe at least being able to pick up on conversations that are happening and feed in as they're happening to give feedback or help out. But since the pandemic, with so much hybrid working, it is how you share your vision, how you manage to do your training, how you liaise with people without actually physically being with them all the time. And that's definitely a changing skill. The other is well-being. The pandemic, and it was probably happening before anyway, highlight a number of problems in the UK around the way that companies worked with their staff, around employee well-being, and a bigger piece probably being mental health awareness and working with people around that. And that is more and more coming into management roles all the time. So I guess big skills, empathy is going to be right up there now, whereas maybe 10, 15 years ago it wasn't. I'm sure many leaders would argue it was. But those type of skills are definitely more important and highlighted more now than perhaps they were.
Did you pick up any generational differences, Chris? We've heard that we've lost a generation of communicators because the younger people coming through, especially having gone through COVID, they are more connected than ever before, but less socially oriented than ever before, because you put them in a room and they're so used to being on their phones and being on virtual calls that they've lost those interactive face-to-face skills.
From this, no, because that's not probably, it probably wasn't as relevant to the people that we were reaching out to for their experiences. As you'll see, people came into management at very different ages, which the report shows, and you would probably argue that age isn't a barrier to progression within accountancy and finance based on the results that came out. But most of the people that would have been involved in the survey, because they're already leaders, wouldn't necessarily have come from a generation that you're describing.
Yeah.
Because I guess my generation, I'm coming up to 45, were just about getting mobile phones. as we've been through, but certainly couldn't do the stuff on them that you could have done that my children's mobile phones obviously
Yeah.
can do. So that wouldn't really have come out, I don't think. But I mean, arguably, again, in a more hybrid world, who's to say that people that have grown up using mobile phones and communicating with people more remotely won't be in a better position to manage the people of the future than those of us that haven't grown up with that?
It's a fair point, definitely. And ultimately, it comes down to, you asked the 3 soft skills in your report that will be needed for future generations. Communication comes top, collaboration is another one, and strategic thinking. What is strategic thinking in your dictionary of life and business, Chris?
So strategic thinking, I think, when we're describing it in this setting, is again, it's probably being able to take the data from different areas, cut it in different ways to come out with decisions that are going to help the business strive, survive, whatever it might be, thrive. But you know, there's more and more usage at the moment of tools which potentially would not have been associated with accountancy previously. There's almost an overlap at times with what we might have thought data science was going to be 7 years ago. But it's not just being able to pull the data out, it's then being able to interpret it to make business decisions, which will help, as I said before, maybe plant the money in the right area to help grow, maybe point out areas that you just don't even need to worry about, so you could save yourself something because they're not part of what's really happening in the business. Into it more deeply.
Technology comes out as a common thread in your report. We can't escape how fast things are moving, the digitization of the world. And we're not getting to the point where financial accounting professionals need to be able to write code, but they need to develop a skill set, Chris, don't they, that involves more than turning a computer on and off and knowing how to operate an Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I've talked about this quite a lot with people recently. So the emergence of AI and automation within accounting and finance, when you speak to this group of leaders, there wasn't a definitive answer to how much they think it will come into play. And that could be because the cross-section of people that took part is so wide, from companies with not an awful lot of money and not in a tech sector to very tech savvy and having the money to invest and try things out. But without a doubt, the job roles we're recruiting more and more, there are skills and systems required which wouldn't have been thought of as pure accountancy, like Tableau or whatever it might be, to pull out that data and interpret it to be able to make decisions around it. And I think there is a thought process that, you know, things around, I don't know, tax, some audit, those sorts of things moving forward, there is a level of automation which will take a lot more of the manual tasks out.
Yeah. Just circling back on your comment on well-being, with finance and accounting functions, the data is there. It's very black and white. It's binary. It's numeric in a way, but this need for better management skills and empathy, it's creating an animal that is got to have a foot in all camps, the technology, the finance, the people side of things. Does that make it harder to get into this role? Because the geeks and the nerds and the people that love the numbers are going to be attracted by that stuff, but there's so much more to this role now.
Again, like, you know, as I said, I've been doing this for 23 years now. There's an interpretation of what an accountant is, which I don't think is necessarily true.
Yeah. So
without a doubt, there will have been people years and years ago that worked from manual ledgers who would be very traditional in the way they worked, and they'd be very, very numbers orientated and maybe not much outside of it. But really, most of the people that I've worked with over the years who run big finance teams are social, fun, empathetic, and also, you know, really strong business acumen and understand the numbers. So I'm not sure the nerdy, geeky accountant is something I should get into, because I think it's more of a myth and a joke than necessarily an overall reality. Yeah.
Slap on the wrist for me for pigeonholing and stereotyping accountants.
No, you can, but I definitely have to work with these people every day. So.
Yeah, you conclude the report by saying this is a time for new leaders. And one fascinating stat you found, Chris, was that 43% of the leaders that took part in your survey don't see themselves in a finance leadership role in 5 years' time. What's going on there?
Okay, so part of it will be age. So I'm sure that if you ask most people around the age of 50 what they want to do in 5 years' time, they'll all say they want to retire, even though that they know they probably can't. So part of it will be age. With some of them, again, you're talking about people that are in really commercial roles. So they'll see themselves starting their own business, going into a CEO role, or maybe there's a group of people as well that see themselves going into the interim market instead and doing more project-based roles. So there's a lot of different reasons for it, but without doubt, the conclusion is that there is a time for new leaders to start stepping up in the next 5 years. And again, if we did this survey again in that time, it'd be very interesting to see what route they'd come through, because I think it will be more and more of the commercially minded people that are at the top.
Yeah. Chris, has been an excellent tour de force of what it takes to get to the top in finance and accounting. Would you just conclude for us with a few words of wisdom and inspiration, really, to the finance and accounting professionals listening who want to get on, want to be good leaders? What would you say to them and the key things they need to be working on to stay relevant, stay competitive, and be employable?
Yeah, I think I've done a couple of interviews with people that have made it to CFO lately around this report and just what they thought. And most of them would just say be inquisitive.
Yeah, curious.
Yeah, be curious, be inquisitive, try and find a mentor within the business that you're in or outside who you respect and look up to. But just get involved in stuff. You've got to do your day-to-day job most of the time, but try and get involved in projects outside of it. Try and speak to non-finance people about how the business really works. Just try and get that really strong overall understanding of what's going on. From a very practical sense, make sure that you are studying towards a professional qualification, or you've got one, because you are probably going to need it as well. And try and stay on top of the changes that are happening within the industry that you work in from a tech perspective, and get an understanding of that, so that you've got an understanding of where things are going to. So yeah, probably if that was those three things.
Yeah. And the final sidebar on this, Chris, you're in recruitment, you are placing finance and accounting professionals all the time. What is a good tip for companies to attract better talent and make engagement of people like you so much easier that you can place people and they stay there?
I think it's important to try and see recruiters as partners, and not CV shufflers and senders. Yeah. So if you're a good recruitment consultant, then you will be meeting the people that you are working with and understanding what drives them and what they're trying to get to. And if a business is willing to give you the time to get to know them, to understand their drivers, then the matching process becomes a lot easier. If you are just recruiting based on price the whole time, and not willing to engage in that relationship with it, then you'll just get sent a lot of CVs and you won't necessarily be interviewing the people that are right for you. You may not know that because you are literally just getting the CVs that are sent you without having a discussion about what you're really looking for and us understanding what the candidate is to match it for you.
Yeah, CVs, curriculum vitae, resumes, as we would say internationally. But more than that, Chris, it is about having an employer brand or a culture that makes your organization a great place to work. That's going to help your kind of work, hasn't it?
Yeah. So again, I think I told you, I was lucky enough to judge the best business to work for in the Thames Valley for 5 years in a row. And a lot of the time I'd go and visit businesses. The first year I did it anyway, and I'd see they had a bar and I'd think, oh, wow, this is amazing. And they've got a pool table. Oh, this is amazing. But really it's down to training progression, having a strong communication in lots of different ways, sharing your company vision, and accepting ideas bottom up rather than just pushing everything top down. And again, if any organization that is recruiting thinks that people don't go onto their Glassdoor, and look at what reviews they've got, then they're probably mistaken. So it's really, really important to try and get their employee brand out there in a positive sense to employ and retain the best talent.
Yeah. Good time to be in accounting and finance, Chris?
I think there's always a good time to be in accountancy and finance. So, it's a skill set or a bunch of skill sets that are needed within businesses. So is it the best time ever? Probably not, but it's never going to be the worst either. So, it's a skill set that is pretty recession proof. People need it.
That's a great message to finish on. Chris Goulding from Wade Macdonald, been brilliant talking to you today. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Thanks a lot, Rob. Cheers.